Born in the mid-60s, childhood through the 70s, came of age in the 80s. And I remember from a very early age, I was constantly asked, so what are you going to do when you grow up? Right? Anybody else ever get that? Yeah. I swore I was never going to do that to my godson, and I did it the other day. But I remember my mother and my father were very adamant. They were like, you can be anything you want to be, Sean. And I remember it was sort of like, it was more than that. It was sort of like, you will be anything that you want to be, okay? I remember feeling kind of like, okay, sure, And I now that I can look back on this time period, and I realize, what a change of culture was going on that I was benefiting from in a huge way, right? Because prior to the 1960s and 1970s, really, in our culture, for example, if you were male, if you were a man, it used to be that you just had to get a good job, stay in that job, get your retirement, provide for your family. That was the middle class way, right? That's, of course, why Thoreau, a century earlier, talked about men living lives of quiet desperation. And for women, there just wasn't even really much of a career choice if you wanted to have a career. It was pretty much, you could be a housewife, a teacher, a nurse, again, nice middle class way of seeing the world. But the 1960s changed all of that. It saw an explosion of these norms and saw that when they released that humanity had this incredible potential, all this creativity. When you think about the 60s as a social revolution in many ways, but it was a creative revolution as well. And that's the world that I was born into, right? Matter of fact, these were the slogans that I grew up with, right? Just do it. Be all that you can be, right? So what's that all about? And part of it is that the 1960s saw this birth of what is known as the human potential movement. And this movement sort of also, it came out of this whole milieu of this great, gender norms changing and everything like that, but it was also a reaction against therapeutic models that sort of looked at only at mental illness, not at the mental health, right? And it also looked at religion that tended to pathologize people as well, like you sinner, you, right? So instead, it focused on cultivating that extraordinary potential that advocates believe that lie largely untapped in all people. It's the belief that humans can experience an exceptional quality of life filled with happiness, creativity, and fulfillment if they but tap into that potential and not being held back by those gender norms. So that's part of what my parents were trying to express with me, is that now you don't have to have anything that holds you back. And this movement, it began with this guy named George Leonard. He was a really fascinating guy. He did research across the United States on the subject of human potential for this magazine that used to be called Look. I don't think it's around anymore. And in his research, he interviewed psychiatrists, brain researchers, and philosophers on the subject of human potential, and he found that, quote, not one of them said that we were using more than 10% of our capacity. Now, I wasn't talking about brain capacity, but just in general. We're not using 10% of our capacity. And there were other people like Virginia Satir. We have an expert of Virginia here. She changed much of psychology, so she sort of depathologized psychology and therapy by pointing out that, we have the ability to actually heal ourselves as well. And Esalen, I don't have a picture because I don't have a picture of Esalen. So Esalen at Big Sur became the home ground of this movement, and like other organizations, I think it's back, there we go, Est, LifeSpring, Landmark, I don't know if some of you may have heard of some of these things. They sprung out of this movement. I had sisters who did a number of them. No number of people have gone through this. They really empower you and try to get you all jazzed up and everything. And there's some issues with them too. But it was sort of also the birth of the motivational speaker, right? And that really started flourishing in the 1990s, and now TED Talks are the big thing that get us all motivated. But one of the models that came out of this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Abraham Maslow was a friend of George Leonard and Virginia Satir, and he came up with this model that he basically talked about how if you have your needs, so the needs at the bottom, physiological needs. You need food, water, warmth, shelter, rest, that kind of thing. Then you can go to safety needs. You can deal with those, security and safety. And then after that, you are looking for belonging and love needs. And then after that, it's about esteem and prestige and accomplishments. But at the very high top of this is what we should all strive for is self-actualization. That's what he called it. That idea that we can be creative and fulfilled and happy, but we have to have all of these other needs taken care of first. Now, the human potential movement has seen a lot of iteration over the years. The New Age movement, for example, that was more in the 70s and 80s, was sort of more of a spiritual human potential movement. But it was a lot about our own potential. And more recently, there's something called positive psychology that has come out, and it's sort of another reiteration of this human potential movement. And if you know Deepak Chopra and Tony Robbins, just about every self-help author that's out there, they're the ones, who are doing this, and they're still carrying on a lot of this movement. So, oops, been there, sorry. Now, this worldview, this idea that we all have this incredible potential, has been embraced by most Unitarian Universalists. I mean, it's a big part of how we see the world, in the sense that we believe in the dignity and worth of all people. We too were tired of the pathologizing in religion and calling people sinners. We're a reaction against that as well. And I do believe in that we can solve our problems that humanity has got us ourselves into. So I love the human potential movement, and I preach on it all the time, right? I do think that humanity is basically good and that we all have incredible untapped potential if we would just believe in ourselves, right? As Linda's saying this morning. Because I do believe in you, that you can make miracles come true. But like all good movements, it has a shadow side. And now, some 50 years later, we're starting to see how that shadow side is coming out more and more and affecting our culture. I want to bring this to your attention because I think it's important that we see how this is affecting particularly young people. The shadow is coming out in the increase in depression and anxiety, particularly in those in my and younger generations. So there was a survey that was done by the National Institute of Health that shows that depression is significantly on the rise in younger generations in particular. And you can see that just in 3 years that this study was done, how much that there's been an increase in depression, anxiety, suicide, and with that we see an increase in drug and alcohol abuse, withdrawing, suicide, overdoses. And yet it seems so strange because we also live in this world where communication and human connection should be able to happen so easily, right? The human potential movement was meant to cure that quiet desperation that many people lived stuck in their gender and societal roles, but unfortunately this cure has led to some serious side effects. So I want to talk to you about some of those side effects. So the first one is that there's this social expectation that you must be happy all the time, right? And if you aren't, then something's wrong with you. You're not reaching that self-actualization, right? Which is what we say. So, we like everything. We look for likes on our Facebook page. And there's pressure on young people to get the best grades to get into college. The focus on do what makes you happy, however, has led people to question relationships, careers, and pursuits. And if you don't know what your calling is, because maybe you just haven't lived enough in the world, it start making you unhappy, like there's something wrong with you. You can feel disconnected, failure, a sense of self-recrimination. So this is one of the side effects, which is ironic because it was the opposite of what it was supposed to do. The second is that it sort of creates a kind of unconscious classism or elitism, right? For example, we have a bootstrap culture, right? You must pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. We as a society, we often ignore a person's social location, whether it's their income, their race, their education, their history. We ignore that and just say, oh, come on, just get a job, for example. The third criticism is that it downplays evil. It tends to not want to go there, right? And its tendency to overemphasize the human potential for good and to underplay the evil or the dark side of human nature. So there's this search for the feel-good, right? You know, Tony Robbins, if you ever listen to him, man, I always come away really pumped. It feels so great to listen to Tony Robbins. You know, we want to ignore the evil, the things, the societal evils that we see. We want to feel good. And yet we know that growth comes with dealing with the difficult. Another problem is that it becomes all about me, right? And what I want. That's individualism. It's a me culture. That's what happened in the 80s. It became then all about me. So there's all the, there's my way or the highway. You've got, self-help books that are all about, awaken the giant within, think and grow rich, only work 4 hours a week, how to win friends and influence people. All becomes about how you can benefit and what's going on. And there's sort of this immaturity about how to be in community with the assumption that the community must meet all of my needs for me to be a part of that community. Now, one of the problems with it also is that it never really defined what potential was. Potential what? They sort of said mind, body, and spirit. Okay? So with sort of an absence of a formal definition of what that meant, it turned out that they were saying, okay, potential, if you live up to your potential, that must be visible in some shape or form. And so this turned into kind of the abundance theology, like how to create spiritual cash machine. Like, that's a book. That's a real book that people created, right? And it becomes all about the things and the fame and how many people like you on Facebook and, the money that you have in your pocket. That this is the definition of living up to your potential, that somehow you must reflect this. Now, there's nothing wrong with the human potential movement. I preach about our capacity to affect change, and I encourage everyone to live their gifts and share their talents all the time. I believe in it. I believe that you're capable of amazing things. But this emphasis on potential has led us to question who we are, that if we aren't living up to this idea of potential, then something's wrong with us, which is, ironically, pathologizing, right? So what's amazing to me is that just about every spiritual tradition out there isn't so much about gaining personal accomplishments like this, the trappings of success. Rather, at their core, just about every spiritual tradition, or religious tradition, whatever you want to call it, it's about living a life of compassion. It's not just about compassion for others, but also for ourselves as well. So Jesus said, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. The Buddhists speak of a way of enlightenment that means that our hearts are compassionate and open to all beings. The great religions of the world do not ask us to ignore suffering. Instead, they ask us to take care of one another. So I decided, here's another little Seanism, we need a community potential movement. One that focuses on the potential of what we can do together. One whose potential is about compassion for our neighbor. And there are places where some of this is changing. So particularly in younger generations, you're starting to use some of this technology around what's called crowdsourcing, right? And this is not just crowdsourcing with money, but also with ideas. Matter of fact, there's a whole other realm of human potential movements called talentism. And it's focusing on human capital, the talents of human capital. So, but I don't like the way that they talk about it. But anyway, so crowdsourcing. But Occupy Wall Street was a good example of this. That it was about we as a people, what we can do, not what I can do. And they were very clear about not wanting any one person to stand out. And I believe that it's here in this church, in our faith tradition of Unitarian Universalism, that when we're at our best, and we aren't always at our best, but we do try, that this is kind of what we do here. Our religion, if you can call it, is about crowdsourcing, right? Different worldviews. Where's the wisdom, right? So we We look at all the different religions, all the philosophies, and say, wow, there's a lot of wisdom out there. Let's look at all of it. And it's not about turning away from the evils of the suffering about the world, but it's about recognizing that sometimes we need support. So it's in community where we can be vulnerable, where we can be real, where you don't have to be happy all the time. It's in real, authentic community that's asking for help is okay and suffering is acknowledged. It's in community that it becomes less about what I want and more about what's best for everyone. And it's with compassion, with love, that successful community is built. So if we want to find counters to these, I think we can find them here, at least in this church. So instead of being happy all the time, bring your joys, bring your sorrows. We have a ritual every Sunday, joys and sorrows. All are welcome. You don't have to be all happy all the time. Grief, sadness, anger, frustration, they all happen here and it's part of being in community. So bring your joys and your sorrows. And instead of creating unconscious classism, we can be inclusive. All are welcome here. You don't have to be perfect, to have the perfect job, the perfect family, or make a ton of money. All are welcome here. And instead of downplaying evil, we look for justice. We aren't going to hide away, and I don't want to look at it. I don't want to look at that. Believe me, sometimes I don't want to look at that. But we do. We go, okay, we are going to look at the injustices of the world. Name the ism, we look at it. Because you can't change what you ignore. And that all about me thing, well, I think it's about crowdsourcing and community. Without all of you on Sunday morning, boy, it'd just be up here me speaking. Pretty boring. And we crowdsource everything, right? I mean, we crowdsource the financing of the church so that all the staff get paid. We have all the volunteers who run slideshows and do music and sing. It's all crowdsourced. And of course, we access to all these different religious traditions that we draw upon. And if we're going to look at potential, let's look at the potential of love. Love is the spirit of this church. We say that every single week. And I see it every day. And people text me. They say, hey, did you know so-and-so is really hurting? Oh, I reached out to so-and-so because I heard that someone that they love passed away. And I just love that people are reaching out to one another. There's a generosity of spirit to embrace the lonely. Originally the Human Potential Movement was about helping people live their own authentic lives to the fullest so that ultimately it would benefit society. And for many it did do that. But for newer generations, the focus has been less on betterment of society, but focus on you have to do this. The pressure to perform, to change the world has led to deepening of depression and loneliness, and the fix to this is community. Powerful, authentic, bring all who you are, inclusive community. A safe place to explore all of who you are. It's what we try to teach in our religious education classes. And I hope it's what we preach here on Sunday, because we do believe in you, that you can make miracles come true. And even if you don't, you're welcome here. Blessed be and amen. Let us sing.